Hi guys, welcome back. So today we're actually going to start talking about the civil rights movement itself, and we're actually going to backtrack a little and go back to the early days of Jim Crow and segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, and even back to the 1950s and Dwight Eisenhower and his response. This will be kind of a rather short video, but in your notes you need to label this as the Civil Rights Movement Part 1, and today we're going to talk about the system of segregation. And so the laws in the country at the time were known as kind of Jim Crow laws, and many of them were passed in the 1890s in many southern states. And the idea is that it's going to keep segregation, keep the races apart. Now in Africa, they would call it something like apartheid, which literally meant apartness. But for segregation, they're literally going to keep the two races separate. All right? And it affected all aspects of life. Everything from schools, to railroad cars, to buses, to elevators, to lunch counters, to restrooms, to watering fountains, to anything. There were instances where in some local municipalities had laws that said if you were an African American, you're walking down the street and a white person approaches you, you need to either move off of the sidewalk or move out of their way even to that point. So this Jim Crow laws has its tentacles in every single element of society. And remember, at the same time too, there's also more bigotry and hatred that is out there. You're also getting the poll taxes and literacy tests at the voting block. And so for African Americans in the South, it is really a distasteful way of life. And towards the 1950s, after World War II, African Americans really start to, after feeling that renewed sense of purpose and belonging in American society and that pushed for equality, really start to push back against the idea of things like Jim Crow laws. Now, there are actually two versions of segregation. There's de jure segregation, which means that segregation imposed by law. That would be like your local municipality saying that we have, separate schools for races. Then you have de facto segregation, and what that means is that segregation by fact or circumstance. That's kind of the segregation that we still largely have today in America. And what it means is it's not a law necessarily doing that, but for instance, maybe a neighborhood is majority white or majority black, and so as a result then things like schools are predominantly one race or the other. That happens particularly in major cities where you'll have suburban areas that tend to be more white, and then you'll have inner city, more urban areas that tend to be more African American or other races. But it tends to be mainly either when we talk about de facto segregation, we're talking about that it's something that happens naturally, but through the guise of race and circumstance. Now, one of the most important civil rights cases in history was Plessy versus Ferguson, and this case said that the Supreme Court says that segregation is legal, that you can have separate but equal facilities. So, for instance, if you have a white school in town, then you must have a black school, and that black school must be completely equal. That means they must have equal quality of teachers, equal textbooks, equal facilities. And while that sounds great on paper, sure, that could probably happen, it doesn't actually. And we know from history that predominantly those African American schools were much lower quality and were given much less resources than the white schools were. In part because, and we still have in many places today this issue, things like taxes pay for schools. And if you are somebody who is white and you have a good job and you have a good house because you don't have these socially constructed things to keep you down, then you're going to be able to pay more taxes, which means that money goes to your school, which means your schools do better. If you live in a more poor area, and at this time, particularly if you're African American and you don't have very much advantages to pull yourself up and move up the social ladder, then you're going to have crappier jobs, which means then you're going to also not be able to have as much money to pay for taxes, which means then your school is not going to have as much money to run. So we still have a lot of this issue today in America of maybe inner city urban schools having a rougher time and having less money, while maybe suburban, more affluent communities have more money to give to their schools to devote to give them better resources and more teachers. We still have this problem today, and it ties back all the way to things like taxes and that de facto segregation. Now, I'm not going to read you the 14th Amendment. You can pause it if you want to, but basically it's saying that the government will not and shall not enforce a law that tramples on somebody's civil liberties. Now, Brown v. Board of Education is what eventually overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1954, the Supreme Court makes a decision based on this, and it says that segregated schools, for instance, are not legal. That what happens is that while it's great on paper and it sounds amazing that we'll have separate but equal, they're never equal. And Thurgood Marshall, an NCAA lawyer, leads the defense and it helps overturn this. And what that means is it's going to start to integrate schools. So we have segregation before where people are separated. Now we're going to integrate, which means African Americans and whites and other minorities all need to go to school together if that's where they are districted to go. What happens? Well, particularly in the South, there's a large resistance to this. And you get what's known for the first time as white flight, meaning that students who were in public schools that were maybe mostly all white before suddenly begin to move out of districts and move into more private schools where you have to pay money, which maybe meant that, again, that de facto segregation falls in because African Americans maybe didn't have the money to pay for it. It also then affects poor white students as well, but more affluent white parents aren't caring about them. It ends up coming to a head in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the National Guard is called in by Dwight Eisenhower at the time in 1957 to integrate the school because the local leaders had said there was no way they were going to have an integrated school regardless of what the law said. It becomes known as the crisis in Little Rock, and this woman, Elizabeth Eckford, was one of the first people to integrate the school, and she was seen on national TV quietly walking into school being jeered by white students before being turned away from the high school. Eventually, the National Guard is called in, and she is allowed to forcibly enter the school and go to classes. And it's one of the first big high-profile integration cases that had happened. Now, next time we're going to talk about the leaders of the movement, but this is what basically has been happening in the 1950s. We're going to now mainly move to the 1960s where we really start to see it. But if you remember from our past videos, we've talked about things like post-war America and what America had been like, and how African Americans in particular had started to take a greater role within mainstream society. Couple that with things like Plessy versus Ferguson being overturned by Brown versus Board of Education, and people like Elizabeth Eckford, who's been out integrating schools, and you're going to see now this jumping off point for more influence and more power within society. And so tomorrow we'll talk about the leaders of the movement themselves, who they were, what they were doing, and how they had an impact on society. Until then, make sure you have this in your notes. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you all tomorrow.